At 01:05 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Private Marcus Heim pushed himself through the door of a C-47 Skytrain 2000 FT above Normandy, watching tracer fire slice the darkness below. 20 years old, first combat jump, 0 kills. The 82nd Airborne Division was dropping 6,400 men onto the Cotentin Peninsula with one mission: seize the bridges over the Murderay River before German reinforcements could reach Utah Beach. Without those bridges, the entire D-Day invasion could collapse in hours. Heim hit the ground 25 FT from a dirt road. Before he could assemble his rifle, he heard a motorcycle approaching. 2 German soldiers passed within yards. He stayed flat in the mud and let them go. Around him, paratroopers were drowning in the marshes. The Germans had flooded the Murderay Valley weeks earlier. What should have been a narrow river was now a swamp 1,000 YD wide. Men, loaded with 70 lb of equipment, sank straight to the bottom. By dawn, battalion commanders were finding empty parachutes floating in 3 FT of water. He moved inland and found 11 men from a company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Their objective was Fière Bridge, 2 km west of St. Mir-Illis. The bridge crossed a stone causeway 500 YD long. It was the only dry route west of the Murderay. If the Germans held it, American forces coming from Utah Beach would be trapped on the coast. The invasion would stall before it began. Lieutenant John Dolan assembled 90% of a company by 6 a.m. Most units that night were scattered across 10 miles of French countryside. The 505th had trained for night jumps in England. They knew how to find each other in the dark. They had practiced the mission until every man could navigate it blind. Dolan led them toward the bridge through hedgerows and farm fields. At the manor house beside Lafayette, they found 28 German infantrymen dug in. After 30 minutes of close fighting with grenades and rifle fire, the manor was clear. At 1:45 p.m., 2 men scouted the bridge itself. German soldiers hiding on the far side tried to ambush them. Private James Mattingly shot the first man, then wounded and captured the rest. The bridge was clear. A company placed a 9-man force at the western end of the hamlet of Kokini. They blocked the causeway with a German truck and laid anti-tank mines beside it. Heim was assigned to a bazooka team with PFC Leonard Peterson. Peterson was Swedish. He barely spoke English, but he could aim a rocket better than any man in the company. They dug in behind a concrete telephone pole near the manor, facing west toward Kokini. The pole was 2 ft thick. It would stop small arms fire, but nothing heavier. 2 more bazooka men, John Boulderson and Gordon Prime, took position on the opposite side of the road. Behind them, a 57mm anti-tank gun and a machine gun covered the causeway. The problem was simple. The Germans had tanks. A company had bazookas and rifles. Major Frederick Kellum, commanding the 1st Battalion, knew what was coming. Every man at Lafayette knew the causeway was a kill zone. No cover for 500 YD. Anyone crossing it would be exposed from both sides. And German armor was massing in Kokini. At 400 p.m., shells began hitting the manor. German mortars walked their fire along the eastern bank of the Murder. The stonework of the manor absorbed most of the shrapnel. Rumor spread through the company that a counterattack was forming. Heim checked his rockets. Peterson adjusted the sight on the bazooka. They had 6 rounds between them. The 57mm gun had maybe 20 shells. That was all that stood between 3 German tanks and the road to Smigels. If you want to see how Heim's desperate bazooka stand turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten battles with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to him. At 5:00 p.m., Heim heard the sound he'd been dreading since dawn. Tank tracks, metal grinding on stone, coming from Kokken. Peterson raised his head above the foxhole and looked down the causeway. 3 tanks, infantry behind them, all heading straight for Lafayette Bridge. The 3 tanks were Renault R35s, French tanks captured in 1940. The Germans used them for training battalions and static defense. Each one weighed 10 tons and carried a 37mm gun in the turret. Against infantry, they were lethal. The Renault had 12mm of armor on the sides. A bazooka could penetrate 8 in of steel at close range, but the crew had to get the shot right. Heim and Peterson watched the lead tank round the curve in the causeway, 400 YD away. Infantry moved on both sides of the road, maybe 30 men. Behind the first tank came a second, then a third. The German commander knew the causeway was narrow. He was using the tanks as shields. The infantry would follow them across and overwhelm the American position with numbers. Peterson loaded a rocket. Heim crouched beside him with 3 more rounds ready. On the other side of the road, Boulderson and Prime did the same. The 57mm gun crew adjusted their aim. The machine gun in the Mannerard opened up first. Tracer rounds cut across the causeway toward the German infantry. Men dropped. Others scattered into the marsh on both sides. The lead tank kept coming. Its commander stood up in the turret to get a better view of the bridge. He was maybe 20 mellers from the western end of the causeway when the machine gun found him. A burst caught him in the chest. He fell backward into the turret. The tank slowed but didn't stop. It kept rolling forward. Peterson fired. The rocket left the tube with a crack and a flash of backblast. It hit the front of the Renault and detonated. The tank lurched to the right but kept moving. Peterson reloaded. Boulders fired from across the road. His rocket hit the same tank on the side. Still, it moved. The 57mm gun fired. The shell punched through the turret ring. The tank stopped. Smoke poured from the hatches. The second tank tried to maneuver around the first. The causeway was only wide enough for one vehicle. The Renault's right track dipped into the marsh. It struggled to pull itself back onto the road. Peterson fired again. The rocket hit the turret dead center. The tank stopped moving. No smoke, no fire. Just stopped. The third tank was pulling back. Its commander had seen enough. 2 tanks are burning or disabled in less than 2 minutes. He reversed down the causeway toward Koki. German infantry tried to advance without armor support. The machine gun and rifle fire from a company cut them down. Bodies piled up on both sides of the road. Then, the turret of the first tank began to move. It wasn't dead. The crew was still inside. The gun barrel swung toward Heim Peterson's position. Heim saw it turning. 37mm high explosive. If that gun fired, the concrete pole would be vaporized. So would they. Peterson was reloading. Heim grabbed his shoulder. They rolled out of the foxhole and ran 10 FT to the left. The tank fired. The shell hit the concrete pole exactly where they'd been crouching 2 seconds earlier. The explosion pulverized 2 FT of reinforced concrete. Chunks of debris rained down on the road. Heim felt the concussion in his chest. Peterson didn't hesitate. He knelt on the open road with the bazooka on his shoulder. No cover, no concealment. German riflemen were shooting at him from 300 on YD. He aimed at the disabled Renault and fired. The rocket hit the engine compartment. This time, the tank caught fire. Heim looked for the third tank. It had stopped retreating. It was turning around, coming back. The third tank advanced slowly down the causeway. Its commander had watched 2 Renaults get destroyed. He wasn't going to make the same mistakes. The tank moved in short bursts. 5 yards forward, stop, 5 more yards. The turret swung left and right, looking for targets. Heim counted his remaining rockets, 2. Peterson had 1 loaded. That was 3 total against a tank that was now expecting bazooka fire. The 57mm gun behind them was silent. Heim looked back. The gun crew was dead. A German mortar round had landed directly on their position. Peterson fired at the third tank. The rocket hit the front armor and bounced off. Wrong angle. The Renault kept coming. It was 200 YD from the bridge. Now, he loaded Peterson's last rocket. 1 shot left. If they missed, the tank would reach the bridge. Once across, it could swing north towards St. Mirles. The entire American position would collapse. Then, Heim remembered the anti-tank team that had been killed near the 57mm gun. They'd been carrying rockets. He told Peterson to hold position and keep firing his rifle. Then he ran. German infantry on the far side of the causeway saw him moving. Rifle fire cracked across the road. Bullets hit the stone wall of the manor. Heim kept low and reached the dead gun crew. 3 men sprawled around the destroyed 57mm. One of them had been carrying a canvas bag. Heim grabbed it. 4 rockets inside. He ran back toward Peterson. The third tank was 150 yards from the bridge. Peterson was kneeling in the open road with his M1 carbine, shooting at German infantry. Rounds were hitting the pavement around him. Heim slid into position and loaded a fresh rocket into the bazooka. Peterson dropped the carbine and grabbed the launcher. He aimed at the Renault's side armor as it turned slightly on the narrow causeway. The angle was better now. He fired. The rocket hit just below the turret ring. The tank stopped. No fire, no explosion, just stopped. The engine had quit, or the crew was dead. Across the road, Boulderson and Prime destroyed what was left of the second tank with their last rocket. 3 Renaults are disabled or burning on a 500-yard stretch of road. The German infantry began pulling back toward Caney. They'd lost their armor support. Without tanks, they couldn't cross the causeway. Then, something unexpected happened. A soldier crawled out of a ditch on the American side of the road. His name was Joe Fitt. He'd been pinned down by rifle fire for the last 10 minutes. Now, he saw his chance. He ran toward the first burning Renault. German infantry was still close enough to shoot him. They tried. Fitt climbed onto the tank. He pulled the grenade from his webbing, yanked the pin, and dropped it through the turret hatch. 3 seconds later, the grenade detonated inside. The tank was finished. The German attack broke. Infantry retreated down the causeway toward Kokini. Mortar fire stopped. For the first time in an hour, the shooting died down to scattered rifle shots. Heim and Peterson stayed in their foxhole. They waited for a second wave. It didn't come. After 10 minutes, they looked around. The machine gun position in the manor yard was empty. The gun crew had been killed or wounded. The 57mm was destroyed. They couldn't see anyone else from the company. Heim thought they might be alone. He thought the bridge might have been lost everywhere except this one position. Then, someone came down the road from St. Mary Glees, a lieutenant. He told them to hold their position. Reinforcements were coming. The Germans might try again. Heim and Peterson stayed in the foxhole behind what was left of the concrete pole. Around them, the causeway was littered with German bodies and 3 burning French tanks. By nightfall, Heim learned the truth. Of the few men holding the bridge that afternoon, most were either killed or wounded. A company had lost 17 dead and 51 wounded in one day. But they still held the Lafayette Bridge, and the Germans knew it would cost them everything to take it back. On the night of June 6th, a company was relieved by elements of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Heim and Peterson finally left their foxhole. They'd been in position for 18 hours. When they stood up, their legs barely worked. They moved back towards St. Mary Glees to regroup. Behind them, the causeway at Lafayette remained a no-man's land. German artillery hammered the eastern side of the bridge throughout the night. American mortars hit. Kokon on the western side. Nobody could cross in either direction. The 3 destroyed Renault tanks sat in the middle of the causeway, like monuments to the day's fighting. On June 7th, the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment landed by Waco and Horsa gliders in fields east of the murder. Most of the gliders crashed. Wooden frames splintered against the hedge and trees, but 90% of the regiment assembled within hours. Their mission was to break the stalemate at Lafayette. General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne, took personal command of the sector. Gavin understood the problem. The causeway was a death trap. 500 yards of open road with no cover. German machine guns and mortars had every inch pre-registered. Anyone trying to cross would be cut to pieces. But the 4th Infantry Division was pushing inland from Utah Beach. They needed the road west. Without the Lafayette Bridge, the entire Khotan Peninsula operation would stall. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms was trapped on the western side of the Marais, with parts of 2 companies from the 507th PI. He'd been cut off since D-Day. His men held an orchard east of Afriville. Germans surrounded them on 3 sides. Timms had no radio contact with division headquarters. He sent patrols toward Lafayette, but they couldn't break through. On June 8th, Gavin ordered Major Teddy Sanford to take 1st Battalion, 325th Glider Infantry, across the river north of the causeway. Timmis's men had found a shallow forward, maybe 3 FT deep. Sanford's battalion moved at night. They got halfway across before German forces counterattacked. Machine gun fire and mortars hit the column in the water. Men went down in the darkness. Sanford pulled his battalion back. The ford was unusable. Another force under Colonel George Millett tried to push west from Afriville and link up with Timmis. The Germans were waiting. Millett and several of his men were captured. The rest were driven northeast toward the river. Every attempt to outflank the causeway had failed. The Germans held cocking in strength. They weren't giving up the western end of the bridge. By June 8th, Gavin was out of options. The 4th Infantry Division was breathing down his neck. The 7th Corps needed that road cleared immediately. There was only one solution left, a frontal assault, straight down the causeway. Gavin gave the mission to the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, specifically 2nd Battalion 401st GIR, attached to the 325th as its 3rd Battalion. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carrell. Carrell's men had never been in combat. They'd landed by glider on June 7th, less than 48 hours in Normandy. Now, they were being asked to make what everyone knew was a suicide charge. 500 YD, no cover. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery are waiting. The officers called it a kamikaze mission. The men agreed. Gavin met with Carrell on the evening of June 8th. He explained the mission. At dawn on June 9th, the battalion would assault across the causeway. 12 Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion would provide covering fire. 155mm guns from the 90th Division Artillery would bombard Cochin for 15 minutes before the attack. But after that, the glidermen would have to cross on foot. Carrell listened to the plan. He looked at the causeway. He looked at his men. Then, he looked back at Gavin. He said he understood, but in his eyes, Gavin saw something he didn't like: doubt, fear, hesitation. The assault was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. on June 9th. Carrell had 12 hours to prepare his battalion, 12 hours before they would charge into the most concentrated fire any of them had ever seen, 12 hours before the Fière Bridge would be won or lost forever. At 6 a.m. on June 9th, Captain John Sauls walked the length of the stone wall near Fière Manor. His company, G Company, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, was strung out behind the wall. The men were quiet. They'd spent the night watching bodies from previous attacks floating in the marsh beside the causeway. They knew what was coming. Saul had requested smoke shells to cover the assault. Division said no. Not enough smoke rounds available. The tanks and artillery would have to do the job. Sauls looked at the causeway. 500 yards of flat road. The ancient plane trees lining both sides had been shredded by days of shelling. No concealment left. Just open pavement under German observation. Behind the manor, 12 Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion moved into position on a ridgeline. Their commanders ranged the guns on Kokani. German positions were visible through binoculars, machine gun nests, mortar pits, and infantry in the ruins of stone houses. The Shermans would fire over the heads of the attacking glidermen. It was better than nothing, but not much better. At 10 a.m., General Gavin found Lieutenant Colonel Carrell near the jump-off point. Carrell had been wounded slightly in the glider landing 2 days earlier. Nothing serious, but he looked pale. His hands shook when he held the map. Gavin asked if the battalion was ready. Carell said yes, but his voice didn't sound certain. Gavin didn't have time for uncertainty. He told Carell to get his men moving. The barrage would start in 30 minutes. At 10:45, the glidermen would cross. Carell nodded. He walked back toward his battalion. Gavin watched him go and felt a knot in his stomach. Something was wrong. At 10:30 a.m., the artillery barrage began. 155mm guns from the 90th Division pounded cow for 15 minutes. Shells screamed overhead and detonated in the hamlet. Stone houses collapsed. Dust and smoke rose over the western end of the causeway. The Shermans joined in. 75mm rounds hit German positions along the marsh. The noise was overwhelming. Men crouched behind the stone wall with their hands over their ears. Captain Robert Ray stood nearby with 90 paratroopers from 507th PIR. Gavin had told him to be ready. If the 325th broke under fire, Ray's men would charge the causeway and take over the assault. Ray understood what that meant. The glidermen were green. They'd never been in combat. Under concentrated machine gun fire, they might panic. Ray's paratroopers were veterans. They would finish the job if necessary. At 10:45, the barrage lifted. Silence fell over Lafayette. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then Gavin gave the order, attack. Carell was supposed to lead his battalion forward, but he didn't move. Gavin walked up to him and repeated the order. Carell said he didn't feel well. The wound from the glider crash was bothering him. He couldn't lead the attack. Gavin stared at him for 3 seconds. Then, he relieved Carell of command on the spot. Major Arthur Gardner took over the 2nd Battalion 401st GIR immediately. Gardner was already moving. He'd seen Carell hesitate. He knew what had to be done. He found Captain Sauls and told him to get G Company ready. Saul nodded. He'd already removed the bodies of dead paratroopers from behind the stone wall. His men had seen enough death. They didn't need reminders. Saul looked down the line at his soldiers. Most of them were 18 or 19 years old. They'd been in the army for less than a year. Now they were about to charge across a 500-yard kill zone into German machine guns. He thought about what to say. There was nothing to say. He checked his carbine. He took a breath. Then he jumped over the stone wall and yelled 2 words, "Follow me." G Company rose from behind the stone wall and ran toward the causeway. Saul was in front. Behind him came 80 men carrying rifles, bars, and ammunition. They hit the bridge at a sprint. German machine guns opened fire immediately. The first man fell 10 yards onto the causeway, shot through the chest. He dropped without making a sound. 2 more went down before the company reached the middle of the bridge. Bullets cracked past at waist height. Ricochets sparked off the stone surface. Saul kept running. If he stopped, everyone behind him would stop. If they stopped on the causeway, they'd all die. The Shermans were firing from the ridge behind Lafayette Manor. 75mm rounds screamed over the heads of the attacking glidermen and exploded in cockpits. The noise was deafening. Men couldn't hear orders. They couldn't hear each other. They could only see the man in front and keep moving. 100 yards onto the causeway, the German mortars found them. 81mm rounds detonated on the road. Shrapnel cut through the column. Men dropped in groups of 3 and 4. The causeway became slick with blood. Soldiers stepped over bodies and kept running. There was nowhere else to go. Forward was death. Backward was death. The only choice was forward, faster. The company followed G Company onto the causeway. Then F Company. The entire battalion was committed. Now over 400 men are charging down a road barely wide enough for 2 soldiers side by side. German artillery joined the mortars. 105mm shells landed among the glidermen. The explosions threw bodies into the marsh on both sides. Captain Ray watched from behind the stone wall. He'd been ordered to charge if the 325th broke, but they weren't breaking. They were dying, but they weren't stopping. Ray saw men crawling forward with shattered legs. He saw soldiers carrying wounded comrades on their backs while bullets hit all around them. The glidermen were green troops, but they were proving themselves in the worst way possible. Halfway across the causeway, a Sherman hit one of its own mines. The Americans had laid anti-tank mines on June 6th to stop German armor. Nobody had cleared them before the assault. The Sherman exploded and blocked half the road. Men had to squeeze past the burning tank single file. German machine gunners concentrated their fire on that choke point. Bodies piled up around the wreckage. Saul reached the western end of the causeway. Kokini was directly ahead. Stone buildings, hedgerows, German infantry firing from every window and doorway. He dove into a ditch beside the road. G Company's survivors piled in after him. Maybe 40 men were left out of 80. They'd crossed 500 YD under fire and lost half the company. But they were across the first American bridgehead on the western side of the Mediterranean. The company came up behind them. Then, the elements of F Company. The Germans threw everything at the western end of the causeway. Machine guns, mortars, rifle grenades. The Americans were pinned in ditches and couldn't advance into Kokini proper. Then, the German counterattack started. Infantry from the 91st Luftwaffe Division moved out of the hamlet in force, maybe 200 men. They hit the American bridge head from 3 sides. The glidermen were outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements. The causeway behind them was still under fire. Nobody could cross to help. Captain Wayne Pierce, commanding C Company, 325th Glider Infantry, was pushing forward on the left flank. His lead platoon penetrated Kokini itself. Then German forces surrounded them. The platoon was cut off 40 yards ahead of the main American line. Machine gun fire and rifle grenades pinned them in a roadside ditch. German infantry was moving to flank them. In minutes, the platoon would be overrun. Private First Class Charles Delors saw what was happening. 22 years old from Grand Island, New York. He carried a Browning automatic rifle. He'd been in the Army for 18 months, never in combat until 3 days ago. Now he was watching his platoon get destroyed. Delors made a decision. He told his squad to pull back through a gap in the hedgerow behind them. Then he stood up. The Glopper walked out of the ditch onto the road in full view of the German positions. He raised his Browning automatic rifle and fired a burst toward the nearest machine gun nest. 20 rounds. The gun went silent. He moved forward. German infantry turned their attention from the retreating platoon to the single soldier standing in the open. Rifle fire hit Delors in the left shoulder. The impact spun him, halfway around. He steadied himself and kept firing. Short, controlled bursts. Another machine gun position. Then a group of German soldiers advanced through a hedgerow. He could see his squad crawling back through the gap toward friendly lines. They were making it. That was all that mattered. A second bullet hit him in the side. He staggered but didn't fall. Blood soaked through his uniform. He dropped to one knee on the road and braced the bar against his leg. His vision was narrowing. He could barely see the German positions anymore. He aimed at muzzle flashes and fired. The barrel of the bar was smoking. He'd gone through 3 magazines, maybe 60 rounds. German soldiers were closing in from both sides. They could see he was alone. They could see he was wounded. They moved carefully, expecting him to go down any second. The Glopper fired another burst. 2 Germans fell. The rest took cover. Behind him, his squad reached the American lines. All 9 men. They'd made it because of him. A third bullet hit Delors in the chest. This one dropped him forward onto his hands. The bar clattered on the pavement. He reached for it. His hands weren't working right. Everything felt distant. He managed to pull the weapon back up and brace it against the road. Still kneeling, facing the Germans. He fired one more burst. Then a fourth bullet hit him in the neck. He fell sideways onto the road. The bar went silent. German infantry moved forward cautiously. When they reached his position, they found him dead. Around him on the ground were 8 German soldiers he'd killed in the last 2 minutes. 2 machine guns were knocked out of action. The automatic weapons that had been pinning his platoon were silent. the bridgehead held. With the Glopper's sacrifice, Captain Pierce was able to reorganize C Company and push deeper into Kochani. E Company and G Company linked up with them. By noon, American forces held the western end of the causeway in strength. The Germans pulled back toward Afriville. The 91st Lowfander Division had lost too many men trying to hold Kawani. They couldn't push the Americans back across the Meday. General Gavin crossed the causeway that afternoon. He needed to see the bridgehead for himself. When he reached the western end, he stopped and looked back toward Lafayette Manor. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The causeway was covered with bodies. American soldiers lying where they'd fallen during the assault. Some had died instantly. Others had crawled forward until they couldn't crawl anymore. Gavin later wrote that he could have walked from the church at Kakani back to Lafayette Bridge and never stepped on pavement. The bodies were that thick. He didn't know how many men the 325th had lost in the assault. The casualty reports would take days to compile, but he knew it was over 200, maybe closer to 300. The worst losses in a single action the 82nd Airborne had taken in the war so far. But the Lafayette Bridge was secure. The causeway was open. On June 10th, at 4 a.m., the 357th Infantry Regiment from the 90th Infantry Division crossed into the western Cotentin. They passed the destroyed Renault tank still sitting in the middle of the road. They passed the burned-out Sherman. They passed bodies that hadn't been recovered yet. The 4th Infantry Division followed, then armor, then artillery. Everything that had been bottled up east of the murder for 4 days was finally moving west. The German defense of the Cotentin Peninsula was collapsing, and it had all hinged on 500 yards of stone causeway and the men who refused to give it up. The Battle of the Lafayette Bridge lasted 4 days from June 6th to June 9th, 1944. In those 4 days, over 250 American soldiers were killed, fighting for 500 yards of stone causeway. Another 300 were wounded. The German 91st Luftwaffe Division lost 2,912 men in the first 6 days of the Normandy campaign. Many of them died trying to hold or retake Lafayette. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped into Normandy with 136 men on D-Day. By the time they were relieved in July, 33 were left. The rest were killed, wounded, or missing. Marcus Heim and Leonard Peterson survived. So did John Boulderson and Gordon Prime. All 4 Bazooka men who destroyed 3 German tanks in 90 seconds on June 6th were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. It was the second highest award for valor in the U.S. military. Private First Class Charles Glopper did not survive. His body was recovered from the road in Cockidney after the battle. On February 28, 1946, his father accepted the Medal of Honor on his behalf at a ceremony in Grand Island, New York. Gloppers was the only soldier from the 82nd Airborne Division to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in Normandy. His citation described how he sacrificed his life to save his squad, how he stood in full view of the enemy and drew their fire while his comrades escaped. His body was later found surrounded by dead Germans and destroyed machine guns. Official U.S. Army historian S.L.A. Marshall was present during the Normandy invasion. He interviewed survivors. He walked the battlefield. Years later, he wrote that the Fière Bridge was the fiercest battle in the European war. Not the largest, not the longest, but the fiercest, the most concentrated violence in the smallest space over the shortest time. The strategic importance of Fière cannot be overstated. Without that bridge, American forces coming from Utah Beach would have been trapped on the coast. The Germans could have counterattacked from the west and driven the invasion back into the sea. The entire D-Day operation depended on the 82nd Airborne holding a handful of bridges over the Meurthe River. Fière was the most critical, and it was held by a few hundred paratroopers and glidermen with bazookas and rifles against tanks and superior numbers. Today, the causeway at Fière is called Marcus Heim Way. A bronze statue called Iron Mike stands overlooking the battlefield. It depicts an airborne soldier at the moment of landing. The statue was dedicated on June 7, 1997. An identical statue stands at Fort Benning, Georgia. Near the bridge is a memorial plaque listing the names of 144 paratroopers from the 505th who were killed in action. Charles Glopper has his own memorial stele at the western end of the causeway. Marcus Heim returned home after the war. He lived until October 22, 2002. He was buried with full military honors in Middletown, New York. He rarely spoke about Fière. When asked, he said only that it was one of the toughest days of his life. He said he didn't know why he and Peterson survived when so many others didn't. "Only the good Lord knows," he said. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about paratroopers who held bridges with bazookas and courage. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States or Canada? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Marcus Heim and Charles the Glopper don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that